Hey guys, tonight we begin with a society that gave us law, engineering, and public baths, but also poison, paranoia, and people who absolutely should not have been trusted at dinner parties. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If you're walking through ancient Rome, the last thing on your mind is serial killer. Not because you're safe, but because the concept simply doesn't exist yet. You understand murder, of course, everyone does. Rome is not exactly a peaceful utopia where people sit around discussing philosophy and respectfully disagreeing. People get killed for money, power, revenge, inheritance, and occasionally because someone insulted their haircut in a bathhouse. All very normal Roman activities. But what you don't have is a category for someone who kills repeatedly, with patterns, with method, with the kind of consistency that would make modern investigators very excited and everyone else very uncomfortable. There's no word for it, no label, no dramatic narrator voice saying, "And this is where the pattern begins," which is unfortunate, because the pattern might already be happening. And here's the real problem. When something doesn't have a name, it's incredibly easy to ignore. You don't connect events. You don't compare notes across the city. You don't gather a team and say, "All right, this is the third suspicious poisoning this month. Maybe we should look into that." No. Instead, each death is treated like its own isolated incident. One poisoning? Tragic? Another poisoning? Suspicious, but let's not jump to conclusions. 5 similar deaths over time? Clearly the gods are having a very specific kind of mood swing, and from your perspective that logic makes sense. Because Rome is chaotic, people die all the time. Fires break out, buildings collapse, diseases spread, political enemies disappear at a rate that suggests networking in Rome was slightly more dangerous than advertised. So if someone is deliberately adding to that chaos, carefully, quietly, repeatedly, they don't stand out. They blend in, perfectly. And here's where it gets a little uncomfortable for you personally. If you lived there, you wouldn't be looking for a serial killer. You'd be looking for a motive. Who benefits? Who gains power? Who inherits the money? Because that's how Romans think. But what if there is no clear benefit? What if someone is not killing for politics or profit, but simply because they can? That idea doesn't fit neatly into Roman logic, so it doesn't get considered, which means no one is asking the right question, and if no one is asking the right question, then no one is finding the right answer. Meanwhile, life continues. Markets open, crowds gather, wine flows. Someone is definitely overcharging you for bread. Everything feels normal. And somewhere in that perfectly normal chaos, someone could be doing the same thing again, and again, and again. Not because they're invisible, but because you don't even have the concept needed to notice them. Which, if we're being honest, is probably the worst possible starting point for a murder investigation. Now that you've accepted that no one is even looking for a serial killer, let's make things worse. Because ancient Rome is not just unaware. It's perfectly designed for someone to get away with it. You're living in a city of over 1 million people, which sounds impressive until you realize it also means you are one anonymous face in a very loud, very crowded machine. Streets packed with merchants, slaves, travellers, officials, and at least one guy loudly arguing about olives for no clear reason. In other words, chaos. The buildings don't help either. Most people live in insulae, multi-storey apartment blocks that are cramped, unstable, and occasionally collapse, which really lowers expectations when it comes to suspicious deaths. If someone dies in there, it could be illness, it could be an accident, it could be the building deciding it has had enough, or something else entirely. And good luck proving which one. Because here's what you don't have. No forensic science, no fingerprint analysis, no Let's run this through the database and see if it matches a pattern. You have witnesses, which sounds useful until you remember witnesses are often busy, distracted, or confidently wrong. Did you see anything suspicious? Yes, I saw a man. Can you describe him? Yes, he was a man. In a city of 1 million. Very helpful. And even if someone suspects something, what are they comparing it to? There's no central system connecting crimes. No investigator tracking similarities across different neighborhoods. No one standing in a room with a map and dramatically pointing at locations saying, "These deaths form a pattern." Because no one is even thinking in those terms. So if you wanted to disappear after committing a crime, Rome would assist you. Not intentionally, of course. It's just built that way. You move through crowded streets, blend into markets, vanish into alleys, and within minutes, you are just another person trying not to get overcharged for bread. And if your victim is someone without status, someone poor, enslaved, or simply unnoticed, their death might not trigger much attention at all, which creates a very uncomfortable reality. If someone were careful, if they chose the right victims, the right locations, the right methods, they wouldn't need to be a genius. They'd just need to be patient. And in a city like Rome, patience is often rewarded, just not in the way anyone would want. So now you're in a city where no one is looking for patterns, no one is connecting cases, and everyone is too busy surviving daily chaos to investigate anything that doesn't scream for attention. Which brings us to Rome's most efficient solution for repeated, discreet murder. Poison. Because if you're going to do this more than once, you don't want noise, you don't want witnesses. You definitely don't want to chase anyone down a crowded street while wearing a toga, which, let's be honest, is not designed for sprinting. You want something quiet, something subtle, something that lets you walk away while your victim finishes their wine and slowly realizes this was a poor life decision. And Rome delivers. Poison is everywhere, in food, in drink, in medicine, in remedies that may or may not cure your illness, but will absolutely give you a new and more permanent problem. And the best part? It's incredibly hard to detect. There are no lab tests, no toxicology reports, no doctor dramatically announcing, "This man was clearly poisoned." Instead, you get symptoms. Vague, messy, inconsistent symptoms. Fever, convulsions, sudden weakness. Which, unfortunately, also describes about half the diseases in ancient Rome. So, if someone dies after eating or drinking something, it might just look like bad luck, or bad health, or the gods expressing mild disappointment, which means poison doesn't just kill, it disguises. And if you use it carefully, you can repeat the process, over and over and over again. Enter Locusta. A professional poisoner in the 1st century, she wasn't just experimenting once or twice. She built a reputation, quietly, efficiently, and very concerningly, for providing poisons to those who needed problems permanently solved, including, allegedly, Nero, which should immediately tell you that in Rome, repeated killing wasn't always hidden. Sometimes it was sponsored. Locusta reportedly helped poison Britannicus, eliminating a rival to Nero's power. And instead of being punished, she was rewarded, given protection, encouraged to continue, which is not the kind of career growth you want to see in a poison specialist. And here's the disturbing part. This wasn't chaotic. This was controlled, measured doses, tested mixtures, adjustments based on results, which starts to feel less like random murder and more like a system. And in a world where poison looks like illness, and illness looks like everyday life, that system can run for a very long time before anyone realizes what's actually happening, if they ever do. Now that you've met poison, let's make it worse. Because in ancient Rome, killing wasn't always chaotic, emotional, or accidental. Sometimes it was organized, and in certain cases, it was practically a job. Which brings you back to Locusta, who, at this point, is not just experimenting in a dark corner somewhere. She is operating with clients, repeat clients, which is never something you want to hear in connection with poison. You don't go to Locusta once, you go to her because you trust her, which is already a sentence that should not exist. She develops poisons tailored to specific outcomes. Fast, slow, painful, subtle. It's essentially a very disturbing version of customer service. Would you like immediate results, or something that looks more like a tragic illness? And Rome, being Rome, doesn't shut this down immediately. In fact, under Nero, she is protected. Protected. Let that sink in. Instead of being hunted down, she is given security, resources, and reportedly even students, because apparently, passing down your knowledge of lethal toxins is considered a valuable educational opportunity. This is no longer random killing. This is infrastructure. You now have someone who can produce death on demand, repeatedly, efficiently, and with enough precision that it rarely raises immediate suspicion. And that's where things start to feel very familiar, because when killing becomes repeatable, controlled, and almost routine, you're no longer dealing with isolated crimes. You're dealing with a pattern, a system. And systems don't rely on chance. They rely on consistency, which means if Locusta, or anyone like her, was involved in multiple deaths over time, those deaths might never be connected. Not because they aren't related, but because they are too well executed. Each one looks slightly different. Each one has a plausible explanation. Each one fits neatly into Rome's already chaotic understanding of illness and death. So no alarms are raised, no pattern is recognized, no one stands up and says, "This seems like the same person is doing this repeatedly," because from the outside, it doesn't look like repetition. It looks like coincidence, and that's the real danger. Because once killing becomes a profession, and professionals get good at what they do, you don't need violence in the streets. You just need a cup, a meal, or a quiet moment where someone trusts the wrong person. And suddenly, another death is added to the list. Another unfortunate event. Another perfectly explainable tragedy. Until you step back and realize there may have been nothing accidental about it at all. Now here's where things take a very uncomfortable turn, because up until now, you've been imagining killers hiding in shadows, slipping through crowds, quietly repeating their crimes without being noticed, which is already unsettling. But in ancient Rome, some of the most frequent killers weren't hiding at all. They were in charge, which is not ideal. Take Caligula, a man whose decision-making process often felt less like governance and more like, let's see what happens if I do this. Executions under him could be sudden, arbitrary, and based on reasons that range from political to deeply personal. Insult him? Problem. Look at him the wrong way? Also a problem. Exist in a way that mildly inconveniences him. You can see where this is going. And then there's Commodus, a man who decided that being emperor wasn't exciting enough, and that what Rome really needed was its ruler personally fighting in the arena, against opponents who, for some reason, had a strong tendency to lose, permanently. Now, technically, these men are not serial killers in the modern sense. They're not hiding, they're not evading detection, they're not carefully choosing victims in secret. They are simply killing repeatedly, openly, with authority, which creates a very strange situation. Because when someone kills again and again under the protection of power, it stops being seen as a pattern of crime and starts being seen as policy, or entertainment, or justice, depending on who you ask and how close you are standing to them. And that's the real issue. In modern terms, repeated killing triggers alarms. In Rome, repeated killing, if done by the right person, might trigger applause, or at the very least, silence. Because opposing it is not a great career move. So while some killers operate in the shadows, others operate in full view, surrounded by guards, titles, and a system that doesn't question them, which blurs the line completely. Because now you're not just asking, were there serial killers? You're asking something much worse. What happens when someone with unlimited power develops a habit of killing? And the answer, unfortunately, is simple. No one stops them, which means the pattern continues. Not hidden, not subtle, just accepted. And somehow, that might be even more unsettling than anything happening in the dark. So by now, you've seen the pattern. People can kill repeatedly in ancient Rome, sometimes quietly, sometimes professionally, sometimes with a crown on their head. And yet, no one is calling it what it is. Because here's the real issue. Rome doesn't think the way you do. You're used to asking why someone kills, what drives them, what pattern they follow, whether there's something psychological behind it. Rome does not care about your psychological curiosity. Rome cares about outcomes. If someone dies, the question is simple. Who benefits? Did someone gain power, money, influence, remove a rival? If yes, problem solved, motive identified, case closed. If no, then things get awkward. Because a person killing repeatedly without clear benefit doesn't fit into Roman logic. It doesn't align with politics, business, or revenge. It just exists. And when something doesn't fit the system doesn't adapt. It ignores it. Which is great news if you're trying to understand human behavior, and terrible news if you're the one being hunted by someone who doesn't need a logical reason to keep going. Because from your perspective, patterns are obvious. Repeated actions, similar methods, escalation. From Rome's perspective, that's just a series of unrelated events that happen to look similar if you stare at them long enough, which, conveniently, no one is doing. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Without a framework for understanding compulsive or patterned killing, Romans don't recognize warning signs. There's no concept of someone escalating, no idea that someone might refine their methods over time, no suspicion that someone might be driven by something internal rather than external. Which means if someone is learning, getting better, becoming more efficient, there's nothing in the system to stop them early, because no one is even looking for that kind of progression. So instead, each act stands alone, disconnected, explained away, filed under unfortunate but understandable. And you continue living your life, assuming that danger looks like ambition, revenge, or political rivalry. Because those are the dangers Rome understands. But the ones it doesn't understand, the ones without clear logic, clear motive, or clear pattern, those are the ones that slip through unnoticed. And in a city this large, this chaotic, and this confident in its own systems, unnoticed is exactly where they thrive. By now, you've got a system that doesn't recognize patterns, a city built for anonymity and methods, like poison, that make deaths look completely normal. So let's talk about the final piece that makes all of this work disturbingly well: the victims. Because in ancient Rome, not everyone's death matters equally. If you're wealthy, powerful, or politically connected, your death creates noise. Questions get asked, people investigate, rumours spread faster than usual, which in Rome is already quite fast. But if you're not, if you're poor, enslaved, a traveller, someone without family, status, or influence, your death might barely register. And that's not an exaggeration. Rome is a city where survival is already difficult. People die from disease, accidents, fires, structural collapses, and the occasional unfortunate encounter with someone more important than them. So if someone like you disappears, it might not trigger anything. No investigation, no pattern recognition, not even suspicion, just absence, which creates a very uncomfortable opportunity. Because if someone wanted to kill repeatedly, they wouldn't choose random targets. They would choose the invisible ones, the people who won't be immediately missed, the ones whose deaths blend perfectly into the background noise of Roman life. And suddenly, this becomes less about skill and more about selection. You don't need to be brilliant, you just need to be patient and observant. You notice who is alone, who is overlooked, who moves through the city without drawing attention, who could disappear without creating disruption. And then you act, quietly, once, then again, and again. And because each victim exists on the edges of society, there's no one connecting the dots. No one stepping back and saying, wait, this is happening too often. Because for Rome, too often is already a very high number. And that's the terrifying part. Not that someone could kill repeatedly, but that they could do it without resistance, without interruption, without anyone even realizing that what's happening is not random. Because when your victims are invisible, your actions become invisible too. And in a city like Rome, invisibility is the most powerful advantage you can have. By now, you've got everything you need. A city that doesn't track patterns. A system that looks for motives, not behavior. Victims who can disappear without much attention. So let's talk about the final, quietly terrifying piece of the puzzle, the pattern itself. Because here's the thing. Even if repeated killings were happening in ancient Rome, that doesn't mean anyone would notice. Not because the pattern isn't there, but because no one is looking for it. You might see a death in one part of the city. Someone falls ill after a meal. Unfortunate. A week later, somewhere else, another person dies under similar circumstances. Coincidence. A month later, another. Tragic. But still, unrelated. Because in your world, there is no system connecting these events. No shared records. No investigator comparing notes across districts. No one stepping back and saying, this looks familiar. Instead, everything is local. Fragmented. Each death belongs to its own story, its own witnesses, its own explanation. And once it's explained, even poorly, it's done. No follow-up, no deeper analysis, no dramatic realization scene where someone suddenly pieces everything together while staring at a wall of evidence. Because there is no wall, there is no evidence board, there isn't even a concept of needing one. And that's what makes this so effective. Because if you were repeating the same act, using the same method, targeting similar victims, you wouldn't need to hide the pattern. You could let it exist. Right there, in plain sight, because no one has the framework to recognize it. And here's the part that should make you slightly uncomfortable. If you lived in Rome, you might actually see the pattern. You might notice similarities, hear rumors, feel like something doesn't quite add up. But without a system to confirm it, what do? You mention it to someone? They shrug. You bring it up again? They tell you you're overthinking it. After all, people die all the time. Why would this be different? And eventually, you stop asking. Because when the world around you treats something as normal, even the unusual starts to feel ordinary. And that's how patterns survive. Not by being hidden, but by being dismissed, ignored, explained away just enough to avoid real scrutiny. Until one day, if someone ever does connect the dots, it won't feel like a discovery. It will feel like something that was always there, quietly repeating itself, while everyone else was too busy to notice. At this point, you might be thinking, surely people noticed something, and you'd be right. Sort of. Because in ancient Rome, even if no one is formally tracking patterns, people are still people. They talk, they gossip, they speculate with a level of confidence that is completely unrelated to how accurate they are. And that's where rumors come in. Because when strange deaths happen often enough, even if they're not officially connected, they start to create whispers. Did you hear about that man who died after dinner? Yes, but didn't something similar happen last week? Probably just bad food. Or something else. And just like that, the idea begins to spread, not as a fact, not as an investigation, but as a feeling. Something is off. Something doesn't make sense. But here's the problem with rumours. They don't clarify things. They distort them. In a city as large and chaotic as Rome, information travels quickly, but it also changes as it moves. Details get exaggerated. Stories blend together. One suspicious death becomes 3. 3 become 10. And suddenly, No one is quite sure what's real anymore, which, ironically, makes the situation worse. Because now, instead of focusing on actual patterns, people are reacting to noise. Fear becomes generalized, unfocused. You're not worried about a specific person. You're just uneasy. Maybe you trust your food a little less. Maybe you hesitate before accepting a drink. Maybe you start looking at people a bit more carefully, wondering if they're hiding something. And then you immediately stop, because you have things to do, and paranoia is exhausting. And that's how fear settles in. Not as panic, but as background tension. A quiet awareness that something might be wrong, without any clear way to prove it. And without proof, nothing changes. No coordinated response. No organized investigation. Just more whispers. More uncertainty. More stories that almost connect, but never quite do. Which creates the perfect environment for someone operating in the shadows. Because rumours don't stop patterns. They hide them. They bury them under layers of speculation and confusion until the truth becomes just another story in a long list of stories. And in that kind of environment, even if people suspect something is happening, they can't point to it. They can't name it. They can't stop it. So life continues. The city moves. The noise returns. And whatever is happening in the background keeps happening. Quietly. Consistently. Almost invisibly. Even as everyone talks about it. So at this point you might be thinking, all right, but Rome had laws, strict ones. And you'd be absolutely correct. Ancient Rome loved laws. Rome practically built its identity on them. There were courts, judges, procedures, punishments, all the ingredients of a system that, on paper, should keep things under control. And to be fair, it did, if your crime was obvious. If you stabbed someone in the street, robbed a merchant in broad daylight, or loudly confessed to something while surrounded by witnesses, Rome was very capable of responding. Quickly, and often quite dramatically. But here's where things start to fall apart. Roman law works best when the crime is visible, when there's a clear act, a clear victim, and ideally a few people pointing at you saying, yes, that's the person who did it. What it doesn't handle well is subtlety. Because if a death looks natural, or accidental, or just vaguely unfortunate, the system doesn't automatically kick into high gear. There's no forensic trigger, no quiet alarm that says, this doesn't look right. Instead, everything depends on suspicion, and suspicion depends on people noticing something unusual, which, as you've already seen, is not exactly guaranteed. So if someone is killing in a way that avoids attention, using poison, choosing isolated victims, spreading events out over time, then legally speaking, there may be nothing to act on. No witnesses, no clear evidence, no obvious crime. Just another death in a city where deaths happen constantly. And even if someone does suspect something, what then? They bring it to a magistrate? Based on what? A feeling. Several deaths that seem similar if you think about it? That's not exactly a strong legal case. So the system hesitates. And hesitation is everything. Because while the law waits for clarity, the person responsible doesn't need clarity. They just need time. Time to move. Time to repeat. Time to stay one step ahead of a system that isn't built to recognize what they're doing. And that's the gap. The space between what the law can handle and what reality actually looks like. Because Rome's legal system is powerful, organized, and, in many ways, impressive. But it's not designed to deal with patterns that don't announce themselves, which means if someone operates just below the threshold of visibility, they don't break the system. They pass through it. Quietly. Repeatedly. Almost as if it wasn't there at all. Now, every so often, something slips. A pattern becomes just a little too obvious. A series of deaths stops looking like coincidence and starts feeling organized. And in ancient Rome, there is at least one moment where the system actually notices, which is both reassuring and slightly terrifying. Because when Rome does notice, it means things have already gone quite far. According to ancient sources, there was a case where multiple women were accused of preparing and distributing poison across the city. Not one isolated incident, not one suspicious death. Multiple. Connected. And suddenly, what had previously looked like unrelated tragedies began to form something else entirely. A network, which is not the word you want associated with poison. Because a single poisoner is dangerous. A group? That's a system. Now imagine living in that moment. Deaths that once seemed random are now being reinterpreted. People start asking questions they hadn't asked before. Wait. How many people actually died like this? How many of those deaths were not accidents? How long has this been going on? And perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all, how many times did this happen without anyone noticing? Because once a pattern is revealed, it doesn't just explain the present. It rewrites the past. Suddenly those unfortunate illnesses don't feel so natural anymore. Those quiet deaths start to feel deliberate. And the realization sets in that what looked like chaos may have been something far more controlled. But here's where the situation takes another turn. When the poisoners are exposed, they are punished. Publicly. Harshly. Because Rome needs to make a statement. Not just that crime will be punished, but that control has been restored. Which is important, because if people start believing that repeated organised killing can happen without consequence, that's a problem for everyone. So the response is decisive, swift, and very visible. And for a moment it works. The pattern is broken. The threat is removed. Order is reasserted. But here's the uncomfortable part. This only happens when the pattern becomes impossible to ignore, when it grows large enough, obvious enough, disruptive enough, that the system can no longer dismiss it as coincidence. Which means for every pattern that gets caught, you have to wonder how many stayed small enough, quiet enough, to never be seen at all. And that's the real takeaway here. Rome could stop a system of killing, but only after it revealed itself. And anything that stayed just below that threshold could continue, unnoticed, unquestioned, and very much active. So now you're standing in the middle of all this. Poisoners, patterns, disappearances, emperors casually removing people from existence, and you're left with one very modern question. Were these people serial killers? And the honest answer is frustrating. Yes. And also, not exactly. Because if you apply a modern definition, repeated killings, patterns, method, time gaps between acts, then some individuals in ancient Rome absolutely qualify. Take Locusta again. Multiple victims. Consistent method. Refinement over time. That's not a one-time crime. That's repetition. That's expertise. That's starting to look very familiar. But here's where things get complicated. In the modern world, a serial killer is often defined not just by repetition, but by motivation. Psychological drive, compulsion, the internal reason behind the behavior. And that's where Rome becomes unclear. Because most Roman records don't care about that. They don't ask, what drove this person? They ask, who hired them? Which means a lot of repeated killing in Rome is tied to purpose, politics, power, money. And if someone is killing for a clear reason, the Romans don't see it as strange. They see it as efficient, which is not a comforting perspective. So now you're stuck between two realities. On one hand, the behavior is there. Repeated acts, patterns, methods that evolve. On the other hand, the context is different. These aren't always isolated individuals acting alone for personal reasons. Sometimes they're part of a system. Sometimes they're tools. Sometimes they're protected. And sometimes they're rewarded, which makes the label harder to apply. Because calling someone a serial killer suggests something outside the system, something abnormal. But in Rome, repeated killing could exist within the system, which is a very different kind of problem. So maybe the better question isn't, were there serial killers? maybe it's this. What happens when the behavior exists, but the society doesn't define it as dangerous in the same way? Because if you don't recognize something as a distinct threat, you don't respond to it as one. And that's exactly what you see in Rome. The actions are there, the patterns are there, but the label isn't. And without the label, the response is slower, weaker, sometimes non-existent. Which means whether you call them serial killers or not, the effect is the same. Repeated killing, over time, in a system that doesn't fully understand what it's dealing with. And that, honestly, is more unsettling than the label itself. So now you've identified the behavior. Repeated killing, patterns, methods, opportunities. But here's where things start to feel very different from what you're used to. Because fear in ancient Rome doesn't work the same way. In the modern world, the idea of a serial killer creates a very specific kind of fear. It's focused, targeted. You imagine someone out there, unknown but active, and the entire system shifts to find them. In Rome, that kind of focus doesn't exist, because fear is already everywhere. You're worried about fires, about disease, about political instability, about someone more powerful than you deciding your existence is optional, about buildings collapsing, about food being bad, about water being worse. Adding, someone might be killing people repeatedly, doesn't stand out as much as you'd expect. It just blends in, and that's the key difference. Fear in Rome is not sharp, it's constant, low level, background noise. You don't stop your life because something might be wrong. You continue your life while something is wrong. Because that's normal. And this has a strange effect. Instead of creating panic, repeated deaths become part of the environment. Something people talk about briefly, then move on from. Did you hear about that? Yes? Strange. Anyway, and just like that, the moment passes. Which means even if people suspect something unusual, it doesn't escalate into collective action. There's no unified response, no citywide alert, no sudden shift in behavior, just awareness without direction. And for someone operating in that environment, that's ideal. Because the fear never concentrates. It never becomes focused enough to push people into action. It just lingers, quietly, which allows everything to continue. Markets stay open, crowds keep moving, life goes on, and whatever is happening in the background keeps happening too, repeatedly, uninterrupted. Because in a world where danger is already part of daily life, a new kind of danger doesn't stand out. It just becomes another layer, another possibility. Another thing you might think about briefly before deciding you have more immediate problems. And that's what makes this environment so effective. Not that people aren't afraid, but that they're used to being afraid, which means even something as unsettling as repeated patterned killing can exist without ever becoming the main concern. And when fear never focuses, neither does the response. By now, you've seen all the pieces come together. A city too large to track, a system that looks for motives, not patterns. Methods like poison that leave almost no trace. Victims who can disappear without attention. Fear that never quite focuses. So here's the uncomfortable conclusion. In ancient Rome, this was easier. Not because people were less intelligent, not because they didn't care, but because the tools simply weren't there. You don't have forensic science. No way to analyze a body and say, with certainty, what caused the death. No toxicology reports, no microscopic evidence. Just symptoms, and symptoms, unfortunately, are very flexible. You don't have centralized records. No system connecting deaths across different parts of the city. No database tracking similarities. No one compiling lists and noticing that the same thing keeps happening in slightly different places. Everything is local, fragmented, easy to lose in the noise, and perhaps most importantly, you don't have time, because daily life in Rome is already demanding. You're working, surviving, navigating crowds, dealing with constant risk from things that have nothing to do with murder. So even if something feels off, you don't always have the luxury to investigate it. And that's where the real advantage appears. not in brilliance, not in some extraordinary level of skill, but in the gap between what exists and what doesn't. If someone operates just below the level of obvious violence, they don't trigger the system. They don't create urgency. They don't demand attention. They simply exist within the limits of what the system can detect. And if the system can't detect patterns, then patterns become invisible, which means repetition becomes possible. And once repetition becomes possible, it becomes sustainable. And that's the key difference. In a modern setting, repeated killing creates pressure. Systems activate. Investigations expand. Patterns are hunted. In Rome, that pressure builds slowly, sometimes too slowly, sometimes not at all. So instead of being stopped early, something like this could continue longer than you'd expect. Not because no one noticed anything, but because no one had the tools to prove what they noticed. And without proof, suspicion stays where it is, unconfirmed, unresolved, and very easy to ignore. Which, if you think about it, creates the perfect environment. Not for chaos, but for quiet repetition. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that doesn't leave obvious traces. The kind that simply continues, because nothing is there to stop it soon enough. So after everything you've seen, poisoners, patterns, disappearances, emperors casually removing people from existence, you're left with the question that started this whole thing. Were there serial killers in ancient Rome? And at this point, the answer is yes. Just not in the way you expected. Because what makes a serial killer in your world isn't just the act of killing repeatedly, it's the recognition of it, the label, the system that identifies patterns, investigates them, and responds. Rome doesn't have that. So instead of clearly defined serial killers, you have something more blurred. People who kill repeatedly. People who refine methods. People who take advantage of a system that isn't designed to notice what they're doing. Sometimes they operate in shadows. Sometimes they operate with protection. Sometimes they operate in full view, backed by power. And that's what makes this so different. Because in Rome, repeated killing doesn't always stand out as something abnormal. It can look like politics, like illness, like bad luck, like just another part of life. Which means the line between criminal and acceptable becomes flexible. And that's the part that should make you pause. Because the danger isn't just that people could kill repeatedly. It's that the system didn't always recognize it as a distinct threat. So it didn't respond to it as one. And when a system doesn't recognize a pattern, that pattern continues, quietly, efficiently, until something forces it into the open, or it simply blends into history as a series of unrelated events. And that's the real takeaway here. Not that Rome was uniquely dangerous, but that it was uniquely unprepared for this kind of danger. Because without the concept, without the tools, without the framework to connect the dots, even something as unsettling as repeated, patterned killing can exist without ever being fully understood. And maybe that's the most uncomfortable part of all, because it makes you wonder how many stories were never recognized for what they truly were, how many patterns were missed, how many coincidences were anything but, and how many times did something repeat, again and again, while everyone else simply called it normal. The wall stretches farther than your mind wants to accept. It doesn't simply run across the land, it devours it. Mountains, valleys, cliffs, all forced into submission by the Great Wall of China, which snakes across the horizon like something alive. And now, unfortunately for you, you are part of it. You didn't come here chasing glory. Nobody does. Maybe you were a farmer pulled from your fields, still thinking about crops that will now die without you. Maybe you were a prisoner offered a second chance, which in practice means trading chains for frostbite. Or maybe you were simply born in the wrong place at the wrong time, which, historically speaking, is the leading cause of employment on this wall. Your first real companion is the wind. It never stops. It howls across the stones, slipping through your clothes, biting your skin until even breathing feels like a mistake. You quickly learn that warmth is not something you have, it's something you remember. The wall itself is not smooth or glorious like the stories might suggest. It's uneven, patched together, sometimes crumbling under your feet. Every step reminds you that this thing wasn't built in a single grand effort, but over generations. Each stone laid by someone just as tired, just as forgotten as you. And then there's the silence, not peaceful silence, the kind that presses against your ears, the kind that makes you aware of every distant sound, the scrape of boots, the low murmur of other soldiers, the occasional crack of shifting stone. Beyond the wall lies open land, stretching endlessly north, where unseen threats may or may not be watching you at this very moment. You are told your duty is simple: watch, report, survive. What they don't tell you is how long the nights feel, or how the cold settles into your bones like it plans to stay, or how quickly time loses meaning when every day looks exactly like the last. By the end of your first watch, one truth becomes painfully clear. You are no longer just guarding the wall. You are part of it. If the first day teaches you that the wall never ends, the second teaches you something worse. It never sleeps. Your life quickly falls into a rhythm that feels less like living and more like enduring. Wake up before the sun, if you slept at all. Climb the same worn steps. Take your position. Stare out into the same endless stretch of land that, as far as you can tell, has absolutely nothing going on, which would be comforting if it didn't also mean that anything could be going on. Your job sounds simple. Watch the northern frontier. Look for movement. Signal if something approaches. In theory, it's easy. In reality, it's hours of staring into the distance until your eyes begin to invent things just to stay entertained. A shadow becomes a rider. A rock becomes a figure. A gust of wind becomes a threat. False alarms are common. Embarrassing, but common. Because the truth is, no one wants to be the one who didn't see the enemy coming. The officers remind you constantly who that enemy is. Tribes beyond the wall, often labelled as barbarians, especially those like the Xiongnu, whose raids have haunted these borders for generations. You're told they are fast, ruthless, and unpredictable, which is a polite way of saying, if they arrive and you're not ready, your day will get significantly worse. So you watch harder. Hours pass, then more hours. The sun crawls across the sky like it too is tired of being here. Your legs ache from standing. Your hands grow stiff from the cold. You try to shift your weight, but even that feels like effort you can't afford. Sometimes you're not alone. Another soldier stands nearby, equally frozen, equally silent. Conversations are short. There's not much to say that hasn't already been said yesterday, and the day before, and the day before that. And then night comes, which, if you thought things couldn't get worse, is a bold assumption. The darkness swallows everything beyond the wall. Your world shrinks to torchlight, shadows, and imagination. Every sound feels louder. Every movement feels closer. You grip your weapon tighter, even if you're not entirely sure what you're preparing for. Because this is the part they don't emphasize enough. The waiting isn't just boring, it's exhausting. And the longer you stand there, staring into nothing, the more you begin to realize the real enemy might not be out there. It might be the endless watch itself. After enough days on the wall, you stop counting time. Not because you've achieved some kind of enlightenment, but because every day feels like a copy of the last, just slightly colder and somehow more tiring. But there is one thing that begins to change: the men around you. At first, they were just shapes in armour, strangers with the same miserable assignment. You didn't ask their names, and they didn't ask yours. It felt unnecessary, like naming stones in a river. But the wall has a way of forcing familiarity. There are only so many faces you will ever see here, and eventually they become your entire world. You start noticing things. One man hums quietly during his watch, the same tune every day. Another sharpens his blade obsessively, as if expecting battle at any moment. One of them laughs too loudly at jokes that aren't funny, because silence is worse, and slowly, without anyone formally agreeing to it, you become something like brothers. Not out of affection, out of survival. You share food when someone's portion runs thin. You wake each other when exhaustion threatens to win. You stand closer during the worst winds, not because it helps much, but because it helps enough. Stories begin to circulate, fragments of lives left behind. A farmer who misses the smell of wet soil. A father who hasn't seen his son walk. A man who insists he was innocent, which, given where you are, is either true or a very popular excuse. No one presses too hard. Everyone understands that thinking too much about the past is dangerous here, because the wall has a way of replacing it. Even the officers, harsh as they are, seem less like distant authority and more like older, tired versions of yourselves. Some of them have been here for years. You can tell by the way they move, slow, deliberate, conserving energy like men who know exactly how long a day can feel. And yet, despite this strange bond, there's an unspoken rule. Don't get too attached, because men disappear. Sometimes it's illness, sometimes accidents, loose stones, bad footing, a moment of distraction. And sometimes it's something quieter. A man simply doesn't wake up one morning, claimed by the cold as if it finally decided it had waited long enough. No ceremonies, no long speeches, just fewer footsteps beside you. And that's when it hits you. Out here, friendship is not built on time. It's built on endurance. And the longer you endure together, the more you understand one simple, uncomfortable truth. On the wall, these men are all you have. And one day, they might be all you lose. If the cold doesn't break you, the hunger will certainly try. Meals on the wall are not events. They are obligations, brief interruptions in your suffering, carefully measured and rarely satisfying. You learn very quickly that food is not meant to be enjoyed here. It is meant to keep you standing, barely. Your daily ration arrives in simple form. Coarse grain, sometimes millet, sometimes something that looks like millet, but tastes like regret. It's boiled into a thick porridge that clings to your bowl like it resents being eaten. On better days, there might be dried vegetables. On very good days, a sliver of meat appears, usually so tough it feels like chewing a memory. You eat everything. Not because it's good, but because there is no guarantee the next portion will be. Supply caravans travel long distances to reach the wall, crossing harsh terrain and uncertain conditions. When they arrive, it feels like a festival. Brief smiles, louder voices, a sense that the outside world still exists. But when they're delayed, which they often are, the mood changes quickly. Rations shrink. Conversations become shorter. Eyes linger a little too long on someone else's bowl. No one says anything, but everyone is thinking the same thing. How long can this last? Water is another quiet problem. It freezes in the cold, turns stale in storage, and never quite tastes clean. You drink it anyway. You always drink it. Because dehydration here is not dramatic. It's slow, exhausting, and just as deadly. Cooking, if you can call it that, becomes a small ritual of control in an otherwise uncontrollable life. A group gathers, someone stirs the pot, someone else adds whatever scraps they've managed to save. For a moment, there is purpose beyond standing and watching, and strangely those moments matter, because hunger does something subtle to the mind. It doesn't just weaken your body, it narrows your world. You think less about home, less about the future. Everything becomes immediate. Your next meal, your next sip of water, your next chance to rest. Even your humour changes. Jokes revolve around food that doesn't exist. Imaginary feasts. Exaggerated memories of meals that were probably average at best, but now sound like something from a royal court. Someone describes a simple roasted chicken as if it were a divine experience. Everyone laughs, a little too hard, because for a moment they can almost taste it. And then the laughter fades, replaced by the same quiet reality. Your bowl is empty, your stomach is not, and tomorrow you'll do it all again. At some point, the endless watching finally gives way to purpose. Not often, but enough to remind you why the wall exists at all. It starts with something small, a movement on the horizon, not imagined this time, not a trick of light or a wandering shadow, something real, something that doesn't belong. You narrow your eyes. Another soldier notices, then another, and suddenly the silence breaks. Orders snap through the air, sharp and urgent. No more slow movements, no more quiet endurance. You've been waiting for this moment without even realizing it, and now that it's here, your body reacts before your mind catches up. You move toward the signal tower. Every section of the Great Wall of China is part of a larger system, an ancient network designed to carry warnings across vast distances in minutes. No messengers on horseback, no delays, just smoke by day, fire by night. Simple, efficient, terrifyingly fast. The materials are always ready. Dry wood, bundled reeds, sometimes even mixtures designed to create thicker, darker smoke, because clarity matters when your entire job depends on being understood from miles away. You've practiced this many times, but practice is calm, practice is controlled. This is not. Your hands feel heavier as you work, not from weakness, but from the sudden awareness that this signal means something real is happening out there, something that might soon be happening here. The fire catches, smoke rises, and within moments you see it, the next tower, far in the distance, answering. Then another, and another, a chain reaction of warning, stretching beyond your sight, carrying your fear across the empire. It's almost beautiful, if it weren't so serious. Behind you, preparations begin. Weapons checked, positions taken, voices lower, more focused. The men who once joked about imaginary meals now move with quiet precision. No wasted motion, no unnecessary words, because this is what all the waiting was for. And here's the unsettling part. Sometimes nothing happens. The signal spreads, the tension builds, and then it fades. A false alarm. A scouting party that never approaches. A threat that dissolves into distance. And you return to your post, your routine, your silence. But something has changed. Because now you know how quickly everything can shift. How a single moment can turn endless boredom into sharp, immediate danger. And as the smoke clears and the wind carries it away, one thought lingers longer than the rest. Next time, it might not be a false alarm. For a long time, you half believe it will never happen. The signals, the drills, the warnings, they begin to feel like rituals more than reality. Something repeated so often it loses meaning. The wall feels permanent, untouchable, as if its very presence is enough to keep danger away. And then one day, it isn't. It begins quietly. No dramatic horns, no thunder of hooves at first, just a shift in the air. Subtle, but wrong. The kind of wrong your body notices before your mind does. Then comes the confirmation. Movement. Real this time. Organized, fast. Riders. Not one or two, but many. Dark shapes cutting across the land with purpose. Not wandering like traders or lost travelers. These are men who know where they're going, and why. The name passes through the ranks like a whisper you wish you hadn't heard. The Xiongnu. Suddenly, all those stories don't feel exaggerated anymore. Orders are shouted, louder than usual, sharper. There's no confusion now, no hesitation. Every man moves as if pulled by the same invisible force. You take your position, heart beating harder than you'd like to admit. This is it. The waiting is over. From the wall, you watch them approach. They don't move like you. They're faster, lighter, more fluid. Their horses seem like extensions of their bodies, weaving across the terrain with ease. It's unsettling how natural it looks, like this land belongs to them more than it ever will to you. Arrows come first. You hear them before you see them. A thin, slicing sound through the air. Then impact. Wood. Stone. Flesh. Training kicks in. You raise your shield. You return fire. Your hands act on instinct, even as your thoughts struggle to keep up. There's no time to think about fear. No time to question anything. Only action. Beside you, men shout, some in command, some in pain. The wall, once silent and still, becomes alive with movement, noise, chaos. Smoke signals had been distant and controlled. This is immediate and unpredictable. And yet, the wall holds. That's the point of it, after all. Height, position, defense. You are above them. Protected, at least more than you would be on open ground. And slowly, painfully, the momentum shifts. The attackers test, probe, push, but they do not break through. Not today. Eventually, they pull back. Just as quickly as they came, they disappear into the distance, leaving behind silence that feels heavier than before. You lower your weapon. Your hands shake now. Not from cold this time, but from the realization that all those long, empty hours of watching, they weren't pointless. They were preparing you for this. When the riders disappear, the silence does not return the way it used to. Before, silence was empty. Now it feels crowded, with echoes, with memories, with the faint ringing in your ears that refuses to fade. The wall stands exactly as it did yesterday, but something invisible has shifted. You notice it immediately. The men. Some are still gripping their weapons long after the danger has passed, as if letting go might somehow invite it back. Others sit where they are, staring at nothing, their expressions caught somewhere between relief and disbelief. A few move quickly, purposefully, checking supplies, reinforcing weak points, doing anything to avoid standing still with their thoughts. And then there are the ones who don't move at all. You're told to help, not with fighting this time, but with what comes after. You walk along the stone path, boots scraping against dust and scattered debris. Broken arrows lie everywhere, some embedded deep into the wood and stone, others snapped underfoot. The wall, once just a structure, now feels like a witness. You find your fellow soldiers where they fell. There are no grand speeches, no dramatic music, just the quiet, practical work of lifting, carrying, and trying not to think too much about who they were a day ago. Someone you shared a meal with. Someone who stood beside you during watch. Someone who laughed at a joke that wasn't funny. Now, just another absence. The officers speak in low tones, counting losses, assessing damage. Numbers are exchanged, but they feel meaningless. Numbers don't capture the way a man's voice sounded, or how he always stood slightly crooked because of an old injury. Numbers don't stand watch with you. Repairs begin almost immediately. Cracks are patched, loose stones reset. The wall must look as though nothing happened. Because in a way, it can't afford to show weakness, not to the enemy, and not to the men who depend on it. Food is distributed, but no one jokes today. The usual talk of imaginary feasts is gone. Even the loudest voices are quiet, as if the cold has finally reached somewhere deeper than the skin. Night falls, and with it comes something new. You don't just watch the darkness anymore. You expect it. Every shadow feels sharper. Every sound carries weight. The idea that nothing will happen tonight no longer comforts you. It unsettles you. Because now you know what something looks like. And more importantly, you know what it costs. As you take your position once again, staring into the endless dark beyond the wall, a thought settles in your mind, heavy and unavoidable. The wall still stands. But every time it holds, it takes a piece of you with it. After the attack, you expect something to change. Recognition, maybe. A message from the court, supplies arriving faster, warmer clothing, better food. Something, anything, that suggests the Empire knows what just happened here. Instead, the days continue exactly as before. The wall does not celebrate survival. It simply moves on. Word eventually reaches you that officials far to the south have recorded the event. Reports written, seals stamped, decisions made in rooms you will never see. Somewhere, someone important has acknowledged that your section held the line. And yet, nothing about your life improves. The cold remains. The rations remain small. The watches remain long. If anything, the sense of isolation deepens, because now you understand how much can happen here without truly mattering to those in power. You begin to hear more about the empire you're defending. Names like Qin Shi Huang or later emperors are spoken with a mix of awe and distance. Great rulers, unifiers of lands, builders of massive projects, men whose decisions shaped the very stones beneath your feet. The wall itself is often attributed to their vision. But standing here, freezing on a remote stretch of stone, that vision feels far away. Because empires are vast, too vast perhaps to notice individuals. You and the men beside you are not remembered as heroes. You are not written into history as defenders of the frontier. You are part of the wall in a more literal sense. Your labour built it, your presence maintains it, and, if necessary, your body will be buried within its shadow. There are rumours, of course. Stories passed quietly between soldiers. That some of the dead are buried directly within the structure. That bones lie beneath certain sections, hidden under layers of stone and earth. No one confirms it. No one denies it. But when you walk along the wall at night, hearing the wind move through the gaps, it's easy to imagine it carrying more than just air. Letters from home are rare. When they arrive, they feel unreal, like messages from a life that no longer belongs to you. You read them carefully, slowly, trying to hold on to every word, because you don't know when the next one will come, or if it will come at all. And so, the truth settles in, not suddenly, but gradually. You are defending something enormous, something powerful, something that will outlast you, but it will not remember you. And as you stand there, staring out across the endless frontier once again, one quiet realization takes root. The empire is strong, but you are alone. At some point, the thought stops feeling distant. Death is no longer an abstract idea, something that happens to other men in other places. It becomes part of the rhythm here, quiet, expected, almost routine. Not always in battle. Often, not even dramatically. Sometimes it's the cold. Sometimes it's sickness that spreads slowly through the barracks, carried by exhaustion and poor food. A cough that doesn't go away. A fever that burns too long. A body that simply stops keeping up. And sometimes it's the wall itself, a loose stone, a misstep on worn steps, a fall that is over before you even understand what's happening. No matter the cause, the result is always the same. Another man gone. You begin to notice how quickly everything moves afterward. There's no time for long mourning. Duties remain. Watches must be held. Repairs must continue. The wall does not pause for grief. It absorbs it. Burials are simple, practical. The ground here is not always easy to work with. Rocky, frozen, stubborn. Graves are shallow when they can be dug at all. Sometimes marked, sometimes not. A pile of stones, a rough sign, or nothing. Just a place that, after a few days, looks like every other place. There are whispers, of course. Quiet conversations when the wind is low and the officers are out of earshot. That some bodies never leave the wall at all. That in earlier times, labourers and soldiers who died during construction were buried within the structure itself. No one can prove it. But as you walk along certain sections, older, uneven, strangely patched, you can't help but wonder what lies beneath your feet. Whether the wall is not just built by men, but filled with them. And then, slowly, the thought turns inward. What about you? You try not to dwell on it, but it lingers. In the cold nights, in the quiet moments between watches, in the long stretches of silence where your mind has nowhere else to go. If you fall here, who will know? Your family, far away, might never receive word. No letter, no explanation, just absence. A life that simply stopped reaching them. And the wall, it will remain. Stone after stone, watch after watch, another man stepping into your place without ever knowing your name. You look out across the vast, empty land one more time. The same view, the same wind, the same endless stretch of duty, and for the first time, the idea settles completely, without resistance. You are not just guarding the wall. One day, in one way or another, you may become part of it. You've probably heard the story before. A secret brotherhood of assassins, hidden in mountain fortresses. Young recruits taken in, given a strange drug, usually said to be hashish, and then led into a breathtaking garden. Flowing water, exotic fruits, music drifting through the air, beautiful companions welcoming them as if they had already died and entered paradise. And then, just as suddenly, it's gone. They wake up back in the harsh reality of stone walls and discipline, with a single idea planted deep in their minds. Obey your masters, carry out your mission, and you will return to that paradise forever. It's a story that explains everything in the simplest, most dramatic way possible. Too simple, because this legend is most often linked to the mysterious Order of Assassins, a group feared across the medieval Middle East. Their leader, often identified as Hassani Sabah, is portrayed as a mastermind, part religious visionary, part psychological manipulator, and apparently part architect of elaborate fake heavens. It's the kind of story that spreads quickly, especially among enemies. Think about it. If you were facing a group of fighters who showed almost no fear of death, who carried out dangerous missions with absolute loyalty, how would you explain it? You could say they were deeply committed, highly trained, driven by belief. Or you could say they were drugged and tricked. One explanation is complex, the other is unforgettable. And guess which one survives in stories? Medieval writers, especially those outside the group, were fascinated by the assassins. Travellers like Marco Polo helped popularize versions of this tale, describing gardens of paradise and drugged initiations as if they were established fact. The problem is, he never actually visited the strongholds during their peak. But by then, it didn't matter. The legend had already taken root. Because it has everything people love in a story: mystery, deception, forbidden substances, and a secret glimpse of heaven. It turns a disciplined group into something almost mythical. Men who kill not out of strategy or belief, but because they've been shown something irresistible. And maybe that's why the story endured. Not because it was true, but because it was easier to believe than the alternative. Because if the assassins weren't drugged, then their loyalty came from something far more powerful and far more unsettling. Once a story like that begins, it doesn't stay small. It spreads across markets, across courts, across continents, retold by travellers, exaggerated by enemies, polished by writers who were never there but spoke as if they had seen everything with their own eyes. And the legend of drugged recruits and artificial paradise becomes something more than a rumour. It becomes accepted, not because it's proven, but because it feels right to the people hearing it. Think about it from their perspective. The Order of Assassins weren't just another group of soldiers. They didn't fight like traditional armies. They didn't charge in massive formations or rely on brute force. Instead, they operated quietly, precisely, eliminating powerful targets with unsettling efficiency. Leaders, generals, even kings, and they did it knowing they might not survive. That's the part that bothered people the most, because normal explanations didn't seem to fit. Loyalty alone, faith alone, training alone. None of those felt dramatic enough to explain men who walked calmly into almost certain death. So the story evolves. They must be controlled. They must be deceived. They must be under the influence of something. And suddenly, the idea of hashish enters the narrative, not necessarily because there's strong evidence for it, but because it neatly solves the mystery. It gives a physical, almost tangible explanation for something that otherwise feels psychological, ideological, human. The term itself even begins to blur with identity. Some outsiders start referring to them with names that later evolve into the word assassin, tying the group directly to the idea of hashish use, even though the connection is far from clear. But once a label sticks, it's hard to remove. Writers repeat it. Chroniclers expand on it. Each retelling adds detail, more vivid gardens, more elaborate rituals, more certainty. What began as speculation slowly hardens into fact, simply because enough people say it often enough. And here's the interesting part. Most of the people spreading these stories had never stepped foot inside the assassin's strongholds. They weren't insiders. They were observers, outsiders, sometimes even enemies. But their versions of events travelled farther than any first-hand account ever could. Because stories don't need to be accurate to be powerful. They just need to be convincing. And the more this one spreads, the less anyone stops to ask a simple question. What if none of it actually happened? By the time you start looking for real evidence, something strange happens. The story begins to fall apart. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, piece by piece, like a wall that looks solid from a distance, but crumbles when you press against it. Because when historians go back to the actual sources, they find something unexpected. Silence. Not complete silence, but enough to raise questions. The most detailed versions of the Garden of Paradise story come from outsiders, travellers, chroniclers, and writers who either never visited the assassin's strongholds or wrote long after the events they describe. Figures like Marco Polo describe elaborate gardens and drugged initiations with confidence. But there's a problem. His account was written decades after the peak of the assassin's power, and likely based on second-hand stories. In other words, he's repeating what he heard, not what he saw. And when you turn to sources closer to the group itself, records connected to the Nizari Ismailis, the story becomes even thinner. There's no clear evidence of systematic drugging, no detailed descriptions of artificial paradises used as recruitment tools, no internal confirmation of the practices that later writers insist were central to the group. Instead, what you find is something far less theatrical. Discipline, structure, ideology. The assassins weren't random fanatics acting under hallucination. They were organized, strategic, and deeply rooted in a specific religious and political context. Their actions, targeted killings, infiltration, psychological warfare, suggest planning and purpose, not confusion or intoxication. And that creates a problem for the legend, because the more you examine it, the more it starts to look like an explanation created from the outside looking in. A way for enemies to rationalize behavior they couldn't fully understand. After all, if your opponent is fearless, you have two choices. You can admit that their beliefs are strong enough to overcome fear, or you can say they've been manipulated, drugged, tricked. One explanation is uncomfortable, the other is convenient, and history has a tendency to favor convenience, especially when it makes a frightening enemy feel a little more controllable, a little less admirable. So the sources tell a different story than the legend. Not a perfect story, not a fully clear one, but one that lacks the dramatic gardens, the intoxicating substances, and the theatrical illusions that later accounts insist upon. And as you sit with that contrast, one realization becomes harder to ignore. The myth is detailed. The evidence is not. Once you accept that the story isn't strongly supported by evidence, the next question becomes unavoidable. So, where did it really come from? And the answer is far less mysterious than hidden gardens and drugged visions. It came from fear. The Order of Assassins were not just another political faction. They were a problem no ruler could ignore. They didn't rely on large armies or open battles. Instead, they targeted individuals, powerful, protected individuals, and somehow succeeded. A ruler could surround himself with guards, build walls, travel with armies, and still not be safe. That kind of threat does something to people. It unsettles them, because it breaks the normal rules of power. So naturally, Those in power began to explain it in ways that restored some sense of control. Chroniclers working for courts, writers aligned with rival factions, and political enemies all had a reason, whether conscious or not, to reshape the narrative. If your enemy is simply disciplined and ideologically committed, that's dangerous. But if your enemy is drugged and manipulated, that's manageable. That's dismissible. You're not losing to conviction. You're dealing with victims of deception. And that distinction matters. Take the perspective of leaders within the Seljuk Empire, one of the primary rivals of the assassins. They faced targeted killings of high-ranking officials, including figures like Nizam al-Mulk. Explaining such losses as the result of enemy skill and determination might raise uncomfortable questions. But framing it as the work of drugged fanatics? That shifts the narrative. It protects authority. It reduces the enemy to something irrational, something almost theatrical. And once that version of events is written down, it doesn't stay contained. It spreads, picked up by other writers, translated into different languages, reshaped for different audiences. Each retelling adds confidence, less doubt, more detail, more certainty. Until eventually, what began as a politically useful explanation becomes a widely accepted truth. And here's the unsettling part. This isn't unique. History is full of examples where powerful groups describe their enemies in ways that make them seem less legitimate, less rational, less human. It's easier to fight someone when you can reduce them to a story. And in this case, the story just happened to involve drugs, paradise, and perfect obedience. Because that's far easier to understand than the alternative, that men, fully aware and fully conscious, chose to act the way they did. If the assassins weren't drugged, then something far more uncomfortable remains. Why were they so loyal? Because the loyalty is real. That part isn't a myth. Members of the Order of Assassins carried out missions that required patience, precision, and in many cases, a willingness to die. They infiltrated courts, lived undercover for months or years, and struck at moments when escape was unlikely. That kind of commitment doesn't come from confusion. It comes from clarity. And that's where the real explanation begins to take shape. At the center of the movement was a strong ideological and religious framework tied to the Nizari Ismailis. This wasn't just a military group, it was a community built around belief, identity, and a shared sense of purpose. Loyalty wasn't forced through illusion. It was cultivated through conviction. From a young age, members were educated within this system. They learned not only how to act, but why their actions mattered. The world was not random. It was structured, meaningful, guided by leadership they believed to be legitimate and divinely significant. And that changes everything. Because when someone truly believes their actions serve a higher purpose, fear doesn't disappear, but it becomes secondary. Think about it. Throughout history, people have risked and lost their lives for ideas, for causes, for identities they considered greater than themselves. Not because they were drugged, not because they were tricked, but because they believed. The assassins fit into that pattern. Their missions weren't reckless. They were targeted, calculated, often symbolic, removing specific individuals to create political impact rather than engaging in open warfare they could never win. That requires discipline, patience, and trust. Trust in leadership, trust in strategy, trust that their sacrifice, if it came to that, had meaning beyond the immediate moment. And here's the key difference. A man under the influence of a drug is unpredictable. A man driven by belief is focused. The assassins were known for their precision, their ability to blend in, to wait, to strike at exactly the right time. That's not the behavior of someone lost in illusion. That's the behavior of someone fully aware of what they're doing, which makes their story less fantastical, but far more real, because it forces you to confront a deeper truth. They didn't need paradise to be shown to them. They already believed in it. And that belief was enough. To understand the assassins, you have to leave the story of paradise behind and step into a very real place. High in the mountains of northern Persia stood Alamut Castle, not a hidden garden of pleasure, but a fortress of stone, strategy, and control. Perched on a narrow ridge, surrounded by steep cliffs, it was less a palace and more a statement. You don't get here by accident. Every path is difficult, every approach exposed. By the time you reach its gates, you already understand something important. This place is meant to be defended, not admired. Inside, life is not luxurious. It's structured, organized, deliberate. The man most associated with this fortress, Hashish, did not rule through spectacle. There are no reliable accounts of him indulging in excess or building theatrical illusions. In fact, many descriptions suggest the opposite, a disciplined, austere leader who emphasized learning, obedience, and precision, which doesn't quite match the image of a man running a secret drug-fueled paradise operation. Daily life in Alamut revolved around preparation, not just physical training, but intellectual and ideological development. Members were taught languages, strategy, and theology. They weren't just fighters, they were agents, capable of blending into different environments, understanding their targets, and operating with patience. That takes time, and it takes clarity of mind. The fortress itself functioned as a center of coordination. Messages moved in and out, plans were developed, alliances considered. This wasn't chaos. It was careful management of limited power in a world dominated by much larger forces. Because that's the reality often overlooked. The assassins were not the strongest group in the region. They were surrounded by enemies, larger states, powerful armies, rival factions. Open confrontation would have been suicidal. So instead, they adapted. They became precise where others were overwhelming, quiet where others were loud. And Alamut was the heart of that strategy. Not a place of illusion, a place of focus. When you imagine it now, strip away the gardens, the music, the dreamlike scenes described in later legends. Replace them with stone walls, narrow corridors, disciplined routines, and a constant awareness of the world outside. Because that world was hostile, and survival depended not on deception of the mind, but on control of it. And the more you understand that, the clearer one thing becomes. The real strength of Alamut was never fantasy. It was discipline. By the time the story reaches Europe, it's no longer just a rumour. It's a spectacle. Travellers, merchants, and chroniclers carry tales of the order of assassins across continents, and somewhere along the way, the story changes tone. What was once a political and religious movement becomes something far more exotic, almost theatrical. Because to Western audiences, this wasn't just history, it was the East, distant, mysterious, strange enough to believe almost anything about. And that's where the legend truly takes shape. Figures like Marco Polo play a key role here. His writings describe a hidden valley of paradise, carefully constructed to deceive young recruits. Gardens filled with beauty, pleasure, and promise, designed to mimic heaven itself. The recruits are said to be drugged, transported into this illusion, and then removed, leaving them desperate to return. It's vivid, memorable, and almost certainly exaggerated. But that doesn't stop it from spreading, because medieval European audiences were already primed for stories like this. Tales of distant lands filled with strange customs and hidden wonders were popular. The more unusual, the better. And the assassins, secretive, effective, and poorly understood, fit perfectly into that narrative. They weren't just enemies, they were curiosities. And so, the story evolves again. Each retelling adds detail, more certainty, more drama. The gardens become more elaborate, the rituals more precise, the leader more mysterious, almost mythical. By the time the story is fully absorbed into Western imagination, it barely resembles anything grounded in evidence. It becomes entertainment. But here's the important part. These stories didn't just stay in books. They shaped perception. For centuries, the very word assassin carried with it echoes of this myth, of drugged killers, secret paradises, and absolute obedience born from deception. The original context, the political reality, the ideological foundation, all of it fades into the background, replaced by something far easier to visualize and far harder to question, because once a story is this compelling, it stops being examined, it starts being repeated, and repetition, over time, creates something powerful. Not truth, but something that feels a lot like it. Which is why, even today, many people remember the assassins not as they were, but as the legend made them. By now, the pattern is clear. The story is detailed, widely repeated, and incredibly memorable. But when modern historians examine it closely, they don't see confirmation. They see problems. Serious ones. First, there's the issue of sources. The most vivid descriptions of drugged initiations and artificial paradise come from outsiders, often writing long after the events, and sometimes relying on second-hand or even third-hand information. Figures like Marco Polo describe elaborate scenes with confidence, but their accounts don't align with earlier, closer sources. And that matters. Because in historical analysis, proximity to events is everything. The closer a source is to the time and place, the more weight it usually carries. And in this case, the closer sources are noticeably quieter about the most dramatic claims. Then there's the practical problem. Could such a system even work? Think about what the legend requires. A secret garden large enough to convincingly simulate paradise, a steady supply of substances like hashish, recruits being drugged, transported, awakened, and then somehow kept unaware of what actually happened, repeatedly, without reliable leaks, without internal records confirming it, without clear, consistent testimony from those directly involved. It starts to sound less like a historical practice and more like a carefully constructed story. Historians also look at behaviour. The members of the Nizari Ismailis were known for patience, planning, and precision. Their operations often required long-term infiltration, subtlety, and careful timing. That kind of discipline doesn't align well with the idea of individuals acting under the lingering effects of drugs or illusions. If anything, it suggests the opposite. Control, clarity, purpose. And finally, there's the broader context. Medieval sources frequently described enemies in exaggerated or distorted ways. Whether for political reasons, cultural misunderstanding, or simple storytelling appeal, it was common to attribute strange or sensational practices to groups that were seen as different or threatening. The assassins were both. So when historians today examine the Garden of Paradise story, they don't just ask, is this possible? They ask, who benefits from this being believed? And the answer is telling. Enemies gain a simpler explanation. Writers gain a more compelling story. Audiences gain something unforgettable. But the historical record? It remains uncertain, fragmented, and far less dramatic. Which is why most historians reach the same conclusion. The myth is powerful, but it is still, most likely, a myth. By the end of it all, the legend feels almost comforting. Drugged recruits, fake gardens, manipulated loyalty. Because if that were true, the story would be simple. The assassins would not be uniquely disciplined or deeply committed. They would just be victims of deception, acting under illusions they couldn't control. But history rarely chooses the comforting version. When you strip away the layers of storytelling, exaggeration, and repetition, what remains is something far less theatrical and far more unsettling. The order of assassins were not sleepwalking through their actions. They were not wandering in a haze of drugs, chasing a memory of paradise they barely understood. They were aware. They were deliberate. They chose. And that changes everything. Because it means their loyalty did not come from manipulation. It came from belief, from identity, from a system that gave their actions meaning in a world defined by conflict and instability. They operated in a time where survival often depended on aligning yourself with something larger than your individual life. And they found that alignment. Their missions, dangerous as they were not chaotic. They were targeted, symbolic, and often politically strategic. Removing a key figure could shift power, disrupt alliances, or send a message far more effective than open battle. That requires more than obedience. It requires understanding. It requires commitment. And perhaps most importantly, it requires a willingness to accept the consequences. That's the part the legend tries to avoid, because it's easier to believe that men were tricked into risking everything than to accept that they did so knowingly, that they weighed the cost and still moved forward, that they did not need paradise to be shown to them. They carried the idea of it within their beliefs. And that idea was enough, so the myth survives, not because it's accurate, but because it softens the reality. It replaces conviction with illusion. It turns a disciplined ideological movement into something almost fantastical, something easier to dismiss. But when you look past it, when you see the assassins not as characters in a story, but as people shaped by their time, you're left with a different conclusion. Not one of mystery, but of clarity. They were not controlled. They were convinced, and in many ways that is far more powerful and far more difficult to explain away. When you picture the strongholds of the Order of Assassins, you probably imagine men training, men planning, men carrying out missions in silence. And that's exactly how the story has been told for centuries. But that silence hides something. Because fortresses like Alamut Castle were not empty spaces filled only with blades and strategy. They were living communities. And where there is a community, there are always more roles than the obvious ones, including women. The problem is, not many sources talk about them. Not directly, not clearly, not in the dramatic, detailed way medieval writers described assassinations or political intrigue. Women appear only in fragments, in passing mentions, in small clues that historians have to carefully piece together, which makes them easy to overlook, and even easier to erase. But think about it. A fortress like Alamut wasn't just a military outpost. It functioned as a centre of learning, faith, and organisation. It had to sustain life over long periods. Education, communication, internal structure. That doesn't happen with warriors alone. Someone had to teach. Someone had to maintain order. Someone had to preserve the ideological foundation that held everything together. And slowly, when you start looking past the obvious, a different picture begins to emerge. Not one of visible power, but of quiet influence. Women inside these strongholds were not leading armies or appearing in dramatic chronicles, but that doesn't mean they were absent. It means their roles were less visible, and perhaps more subtle. And in a world built on secrecy, subtle roles matter the most, because the assassins thrived not on noise, but on control. Not on spectacle, but on precision. So it would make sense that within their own walls, influence didn't always look like authority. Sometimes it looked like presence, like continuity, like knowledge passed from one generation to the next without ever being written down in detail. And that's where the real mystery begins. Not in what we know, but in what was never fully recorded. Because the more you examine the gaps in the story, the harder it becomes to ignore one simple possibility. The hidden women of Alamut were never absent. They were simply not written about. Once you accept that Alamut was not just a fortress of men, the entire image begins to shift. Because a place like Alamut Castle was not built for short-term survival. It was designed to endure, years, even generations, cut off from the outside world when necessary. That kind of endurance requires more than soldiers. It requires life. Inside the walls, daily existence followed a rhythm that was far less dramatic than the stories of assassinations suggest. There were routines, meals prepared at regular times, water carefully stored and distributed, spaces maintained, repaired, and cleaned. And within that rhythm, roles began to emerge. Women, though rarely named, were almost certainly part of this structure. Not as background figures, but as essential contributors to the continuity of the community. Because without continuity, there is no discipline. And without discipline, there is no survival. Education, for example, did not begin at adulthood. Children growing up within the influence of the Nizari Ismailis would have been introduced early to their beliefs, their identity, and their place within a much larger mission. That process doesn't happen only through formal instruction. It happens in daily life, in repetition, in guidance. And that is where women likely played a critical role, not as visible leaders, but as constant presences. They would have shaped the environment in which the next generation learned to think, to speak, and to believe. In a society built on ideology, that kind of influence is not secondary. It is foundational. Beyond education, there is the simple reality of sustaining life. Food preparation, textile work, care for the sick, organization of domestic spaces. These are not small tasks. In a remote fortress, they are the difference between stability and collapse. And unlike the men who might leave for missions, these roles provided continuity, a steady center, a sense that life inside the walls was not only about danger, but also about order. And that order mattered, because the strength of the assassins did not come from constant action. It came from long periods of stillness, waiting, preparing, maintaining control. That kind of environment requires balance, not just intensity. So while the chronicles speak of blades and secrecy, the reality inside Alamut was more complex, less visible, but no less important. Because behind every act that history remembers, there is a structure that made it possible. And within that structure, hidden in plain sight, were the lives that kept everything from falling apart. If Alamut was built on stone, it was sustained by belief. And belief is not something that maintains itself. It has to be taught, repeated, reinforced, day after day, generation after generation. Especially within a community like the Nizari Ismailis, where identity, loyalty, and purpose were deeply tied to a shared understanding of the world. Inside the fortress, belief wasn't just something you declared. It was something you lived. From the way people spoke, to the stories they told, to the rituals they followed. It was woven into daily life so completely that it became almost invisible. And that kind of invisible structure doesn't appear on its own. It is carried, protected, passed on. This is where the role of women becomes harder to ignore. Because while men trained, planned, and sometimes left on missions, someone had to ensure that the core of the community remained intact. That the next generation understood not just what to do, but why it mattered. Children do not learn belief from orders. They learn it from environment, from repetition, from the quiet authority of those who shape their earliest experiences. And within a closed society like Alamut, that influence would have been constant. Women, though rarely named in records, likely served as key transmitters of this continuity. Teaching language, reinforcing values, explaining traditions, sometimes formally, sometimes simply through daily interaction. And because their work was not dramatic, it was not recorded. No chronicler writes about the moment a child first understands loyalty. No traveller describes the quiet repetition of lessons that shape a worldview, but those moments matter. In fact, they matter more than the visible ones, because a mission carried out years later begins in those early foundations, in the way a person understands duty, identity, and purpose, in the confidence that what they are doing is not random, but necessary, and that confidence doesn't come from nowhere. It is built slowly, carefully, often without recognition. That's what makes it powerful. Because when belief is internalized deeply enough, it doesn't need to be enforced. It doesn't need to be explained in moments of crisis. It simply exists, guiding decisions without hesitation. Which brings you back to the bigger picture. The assassins were known for their discipline, their clarity, their unwavering commitment. And while history focuses on the moments where that commitment became visible, it rarely asks where it came from. But inside Alamut, in the quiet spaces away from the walls and the weapons, that's exactly where it was formed. If belief was the foundation of life inside Alamut Castle, then education was the structure built on top of it. And that education went far beyond combat. Because the Order of Assassins were not simply warriors. They were thinkers, linguists, strategists, individuals trained to operate in complex environments where understanding mattered as much as action. That kind of preparation doesn't happen overnight. It begins early. Children growing up within the fortress would not have been raised with swords in their hands, but with ideas in their minds. Language, for example, was essential. Being able to blend into different regions, communicate effectively, and understand subtle differences in speech could mean the difference between success and failure. But education wasn't only practical, it was philosophical. Religious instruction, interpretation of texts, understanding of hierarchy and authority, these formed the intellectual backbone of the community. Members needed to know not just what they believed, but how to articulate and defend those beliefs. And again, this brings you back to the roles that are rarely described. Because education is not limited to formal instruction halls or designated teachers. It happens constantly, in everyday interactions, in correction, in repetition, in guidance that doesn't always look like teaching. Within that environment, women likely played a significant part. Not as visible scholars recorded in chronicles, but as consistent educators in daily life. Reinforcing language, correcting behavior, shaping thought patterns from an early age. The kind of influence that doesn't appear in official records, but leaves a lasting impact. And in a closed system like Alamut, where outside influence was limited, internal education became even more important. It had to be precise, controlled, aligned with the goals of the community, which meant that every lesson, whether formal or informal, contributed to a larger purpose. Even small things mattered. How a child asked a question, how they responded to authority, how they interpreted the world beyond the fortress walls. All of it fed into the same outcome, a person who understood their role clearly, without confusion. And that clarity is what later appears as discipline, as loyalty, as the ability to act without hesitation. So when history looks at the assassins and sees precision, patience and control, it often attributes it to training in the field. But the truth is, that training began long before, in rooms without weapons, in conversations that were never recorded, in lessons that didn't look like lessons at all, and within those spaces, shaping minds before they ever held a blade, were the unseen hands that made everything else possible. By now the pattern is clear. The pattern, life inside Alamut Castle, was not only about visible roles, but about hidden ones. And in a society built on secrecy, hidden roles are often the most important. Because secrecy is not just about keeping outsiders away. It's about controlling information inside. Who knows what? Who says what? Who carries what? The Order of Assassins depended on communication networks that were subtle, precise, and difficult to trace. Messages moved quietly. Identities were protected. Plans were shared only when necessary. And within that kind of system, not everyone needs to carry a blade to be essential. Some carry information. This is where historians begin to cautiously consider another possibility. That women inside these communities may have played roles in communication, intelligence, and perhaps even espionage. Not in the dramatic, cinematic sense, but in ways that were far more effective. Think about it. In many medieval societies, women attracted less suspicion in certain contexts. They could move through spaces, observe, listen, and interact in ways that armed men could not. Information gathered casually, conversations overheard, patterns noticed. These are the building blocks of intelligence. And intelligence is power. Inside a controlled environment like Alamut, this kind of subtle awareness would have been invaluable. Knowing who is loyal, who is uncertain, who might become a risk. These are not questions answered by force. They are answered through observation. And observation requires presence. Quiet, constant presence. Women, often embedded in the daily life of the fortress, would have been in a position to notice what others missed. Changes in behavior, small inconsistencies, the kind of details that don't seem important until they are. Even beyond the walls, in networks connected to the Nizari Ismailis, communication had to be maintained carefully. Messages travelling across regions required trust, discretion, and the ability to blend in. Again, not all roles would have been visible. And that's the point. The assassins were effective not because they were loud, but because they were controlled. Not because they relied on brute force, but because they understood information, how to gather it, how to protect it, and how to use it. So when you imagine the inner workings of Alamut, it's not just a fortress of warriors, it's a network, a system, and within that system, some of the most important roles were the ones you wouldn't notice at first glance. Because in a world built on secrecy, the quietest figures often carry the most weight. By now, you begin to understand something essential about life inside Alamut Castle. It was not chaotic, it was controlled. Every action, every routine, every part of the day contributed to a larger sense of order, and at the centre of that order was faith, deep, structured, and constantly reinforced within the framework of the Nizari Ismailis. But faith here wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic displays or public declarations. It was quiet repetition, daily rituals, regular prayers, moments of reflection that shaped not just belief, but behaviour. Because in a closed community, belief is not separate from life. It becomes the structure of it. And structure creates discipline. You wake at certain times. You eat at certain times. You speak in certain ways. Even silence has its place. Over time, these routines stop feeling imposed. They become natural, expected, necessary. That's how discipline is built, not through force, but through consistency. And maintaining that consistency requires more than authority figures issuing commands. It requires people who sustain the rhythm of daily life, who ensure that routines are followed, that practices are remembered, that nothing slowly drifts into disorder. Once again, this is where the unseen roles become visible. Women within the fortress likely played a central part in preserving this rhythm, not through direct command, but through presence, through participation in rituals, through reinforcing expectations in everyday interactions. Faith is not taught only in formal lessons. It is reinforced in how meals are shared, how words are spoken, how respect is shown, how traditions are observed without question. And those small, repeated actions shape the larger mindset of the community. They create an environment where belief feels constant, stable, unquestioned, which is exactly what a society like this needed. Because outside the walls, the world was uncertain, dangerous, shifting with politics and conflict. But inside, there had to be clarity, a sense that everything had its place, its purpose, its meaning. And that clarity didn't come from dramatic speeches. It came from routine, from repetition, from people who ensured that nothing, no matter how small, was neglected. That every day followed a pattern that reinforced identity. And when you look at the assassins through that lens, their precision, their patience, their control, it begins to make more sense. Because those qualities weren't created in moments of action. They were built in moments of stillness. In rituals repeated so often, they became second nature. And within those rituals, quietly maintaining the balance between belief and behaviour, were the ones history almost forgot. By now, the image of Alamut has changed completely. It is no longer just a fortress of secrecy and strategy. It is a living system, one that had to sustain itself over time. And sustaining a community requires something often overlooked in stories of power and conflict: continuity. Because the Order of Assassins were not simply a temporary group of fighters passing through a stronghold. They were a long-term community, rooted in belief and structure, meant to endure beyond a single generation. And that raises an obvious question. How did that continuity actually work? The answer likely lies in family life, something rarely described in detail, but impossible to exclude. Marriage within the community would have served more than a personal function. It would have reinforced loyalty, strengthened internal bonds, and ensured that the next generation was raised entirely within the ideological framework of the Nizari Ismailis. In other words, belief wasn't just taught, it was inherited. Children born and raised within Alamut would not need to be convinced later in life. They would grow up surrounded by the same ideas, the same rituals, the same sense of purpose. From their earliest memories, the identity of the community would feel natural, something they belonged to without question. And at the centre of that early environment were families, which means women were not just present, they were essential. They shaped the household, which in turn shaped the individual. The tone of daily life, the expectations of behaviour, the emotional structure of the community, all of it passed through the family unit before it ever reached formal instruction. This kind of influence is quiet, but powerful. Because loyalty built through upbringing is different from loyalty imposed later. It is deeper, more stable, less likely to fracture under pressure. And in a world where secrecy and discipline were critical, that stability mattered. Of course, family life inside a fortress like Alamut Castle would not have been simple. Resources were limited. Space was controlled. The outside world remained a constant threat. There would have been tension, hardship, and uncertainty. But within those constraints, life continued. Children were raised, relationships formed, daily routines repeated. And through it all, the community sustained itself, not just through strategy, but through continuity, which is something the usual narratives rarely mention, because history often focuses on dramatic moments, conflict, violence, power. But those moments don't last. What lasts is structure. And behind that structure, generation after generation, ensuring that the system did not collapse, were the families that quietly held it together. At this point, the question becomes unavoidable. If women were so essential to life inside Alamut Castle, why do we hear almost nothing about them? The answer is not that they weren't there. It's that history was never really looking for them. Most of what we know about the Order of Assassins comes from sources written by outsiders, chroniclers, travellers, political rivals. And these writers were not documenting daily life. They were recording what they found dramatic, unusual, or threatening. Assassinations, leaders, conflicts. Those are the moments that get written down. Not who prepared meals, not who raised children, not who reinforced belief quietly over time. Those roles, no matter how essential, did not fit the priorities of medieval historians. And there's another layer to it: bias. In many historical traditions, women were already less likely to be recorded unless they held overt political power or were involved in extraordinary events. If their influence was subtle, domestic, educational, or social, it often went unnoticed or was considered unworthy of documentation. So even when women played important roles, those roles were filtered out, ignored, or simply never written down. Add to that the nature of Alamut itself, a closed, secretive environment, and the silence becomes even easier to understand. Information leaving the fortress was limited. What did leave was often controlled or observed by outsiders who had their own perspectives, their own assumptions, and those assumptions shaped the record. A fortress of assassins becomes a story about assassins, not about families, not about education, not about the quiet systems that made everything possible. Over time, that selective storytelling becomes the dominant narrative. It's repeated, expanded, reinforced, until it feels complete, but it isn't. It's missing entire layers of reality, and the absence becomes self-perpetuating. Future historians rely on earlier sources. Gaps remain unfilled because no one thinks to question them deeply enough. Until someone does. Until someone looks at the silence itself and asks what it means. Because silence in history is rarely neutral. It often points to something overlooked, something underestimated, something that didn't fit the story people wanted to tell. And in the case of Alamut, that silence hides a crucial truth. Not that women were unimportant, but that their importance was never properly recorded. And once you see that, the story of the assassins no longer feels complete. It feels unfinished. By the time you reach the end of this story, something feels incomplete. Not because we lack facts about the order of assassins, but because we've been looking at only half of them. For centuries, the focus has been narrow. Blades, missions, leaders, fear, a story built around visible action. But behind every visible system, there is an invisible one. And in Alamut, that invisible system is what allowed everything else to exist in the first place. Because without continuity, there is no discipline. Without discipline, there is no precision. And without precision, the assassins would have been just another forgotten group in a long line of failed movements. So something sustained them. Something quieter than strategy, but just as powerful. And that something was the structure of daily life, the transmission of belief, the maintenance of order, the shaping of identity from the earliest stages. A structure that, as you've seen, could not exist without the presence of women. Not as background figures, but as foundations, the hidden half of the system. They were there in the routines that never made it into chronicles, in the lessons that were never formally recorded, in the conversations that shaped how children understood the world long before they ever held responsibility. They did not need titles to have influence. They did not need to appear in history books to shape history itself, because influence does not always announce itself. Sometimes it operates quietly, consistently, relentlessly, and that's what makes it so easy to miss. The assassins were known for their secrecy, their control, their ability to operate without being seen, but that same principle applied within their own walls. Not everything important was visible. Not everything essential was documented. And perhaps that is the most fitting detail of all, that in a society defined by secrecy, even its own structure remained partly hidden. So when you think about Alamut now, it is no longer just a fortress of men and missions. It is a community, a system, a world where visible power depended entirely on invisible support. And once you understand that, the story changes. It becomes less about mystery and more about recognition. Because the hidden women of Alamut were never truly absent. They were simply written out of the narrative. And in doing so, history didn't erase them completely. It just left us with a story that was never whole.